So good morning. Thanks for inviting me back again. You guys keep inviting me back, which sometimes I wonder why, but I'm always happy to come. And if you're watching this or if you're here for the first time, my name is Kurt Wise. Live in Kelowna with my wife, who I met in college. Met her at Heston College, actually. Has anybody here attended Heston? Wow, quite a few. Has anybody here met their spouse at Heston? A few of you, all right. And so did we. That's where I met Don. You know, there was a saying going around that said, if you want to study, go to EMC, or EMU now. If you want to party, go to Goshen. And if you want to get married, go to Heston. That wasn't my intent when I went, but it was a great side benefit. I attended Heston for 2 years. I graduated from there. I went to EMC, I guess, for 2 years and graduated from there. And then I've taken classes at AMBS and Elkhart, kind of related to Goshen. So, been around all of those schools. That said, I think all of those schools have changed, and I would think long and hard about sending my children to them today. But in the early 80s, when I was looking for a school, I was looking for a small Christian school that had a 2-year program in information systems and computers. And there weren't very many of them. And I was looking and trying to find one because I graduated from a high school. There were 13 in my class. My senior year, there were 23 in high school. So our class was over half of the high school. And so I didn't want to go to some huge university where there were going to be thousands of students. I wanted to go to the smallest place I could find. Heston seemed to fit the bill. But as those of you who have attended there, there's not a whole lot to do in Heston. I mean, Heston is kind of, even if you haven't been, you can just imagine a small town in Kansas, right? There's not a whole lot to do. And so that wasn't, it was kind of a struggle at times. It was better after I met Dawn, because at least I had someone to hang out with. But the thing that we would do at Heston, and anyone who has been to Heston knows this, you go to Drubers, right? Drubers was in Newton, about 8 miles away. It was the closest thing to really do. It was a donut shop. And it opened up at 11 o'clock at night and closed at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I think the guy that owned it figured if you had to be there making donuts, he might as well open up the door. And so at 11 o'clock, 11, 12, 1, whatever, there would always be students going in the middle of the night to supposedly study, but maybe to play cards or just to hang out. And there would be an occasional truck driver would come in, and there would be the police would come in because, they're police and they had to fit the stereotype of stopping at the donut shops. But we would go to Drubers, and then while you were at Drubers, the nice thing was that even though as college students we didn't have much money, he had a microwave sitting on the counter that you could use, and he would sell you the day-old donuts for half price. And so as college students, we could go and get day-old donuts and warm them up and sit there and play cards or study. But whatever we were going to do. But, when the closest thing to do is a donut shop 8 miles away, there's not a lot. If you wanted to go to a movie, if you wanted to go bowling, you had to drive 45 minutes to Wichita. So for those of us that came from a rural background, maybe it wasn't real bad, but for those who came from an urban background, from a larger city, Heston was in the middle of nowhere. And I don't know, I never hated Heston. I enjoyed my time there. There were some people that didn't. And the saying that you would hear is happiness is Heston in your rearview mirror. Right? Happiness is leaving it behind, which brings me to my sermon title this morning, of Moab in the rearview mirror. We're going to be looking at the book of Ruth a little bit this morning, so if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn there or scroll there or whatever format your Bible takes. Ruth chapter 1 it's the eighth book in the Old Testament, I think, if that helps you find it. It's short, just 4 chapters, a total of 85 verses. And if Ruth were a movie, I look at the books of the Bible sometimes, I think, what would this book be if it was a film? Ruth would probably be a Hallmark movie. Right? So sorry, guys, you're going to have to just sit through it. Right? I mean, some of the books of the Bible, they would be documentaries. Some of them would be action movies or war movies. Some of them would be sci-fi. Some of them, I'm not sure what Song of Solomon would be, but I know that it wouldn't be rated G. But Ruth is a romance or a Hallmark movie. And I say this for two reasons. One, the plot line. Woman down on her luck, right? Woman destitute, nothing's going her way. She falls in love, she gets married, she lives happily ever after. That's the plot of every Hallmark movie. That's the sum of Ruth. But also, guys, when we go to a movie, we tend to like the action movies, right? There's lots of things happening. In Ruth, there's lots of dialogue. Over half of the verses in Ruth, I think 60% of them are conversations, are dialogue. So if you're into action, there's not a lot in Ruth. But that said, there's a lot in here that we can learn. So we're going to dig in. We're going to look at Ruth chapter 1. Beginning in verse 1, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of their sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there." Okay, so if we dig into this a little bit, it starts out saying, "In the days when the judges ruled." So you remember from your study of the scripture that the Israelites, they spent 400 years in Egypt. They became slaves there. They actually went there because of a famine, which we'll see a famine here too. But they went to Israel. They didn't have a leader, and God appointed Moses to come and lead them out of Egypt to the promised land. Actually, he was supposed to lead them into the promised land, but because of sin, the people they spent 40 years in the wilderness, and then because of Moses' sin, he also dies in the wilderness. And so then God appointed a new leader in Joshua to come and lead them as they crossed the Jordan River and conquered the land. And then there was this time without a leader. And the people, they kind of floundered, and God raised up judges at certain times to come. And the judges, they would serve as a military leader or a spiritual leader, but just for a time period. It wasn't an inherited position like a king could be. It wasn't a conquest position. It was a position that God gave for a little time. But this period of 300 years, there were judges off and on, but not all the time. And so during this time of the judges, this Ruth, the chapter right before, or the book right before is Judges, the last verse of Judges, it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." So that's the time frame that this happening in Ruth, a time in the days of Judges when there was no king in Israel. And so it was a time when at times there was strong leadership and times there wasn't. It was touch and go. The people, they often didn't want a leader. And we're kind of like that, right? We want to do what's right in our own eyes. We want to do our own thing. That's human nature. And so we often don't want a leader, and sometimes we can get by without a leader, but then a crisis comes up. And in times of crisis, the lack of leadership or the evidence of leadership is most there, and it's when we want a leader. And think back over your own lifetimes of major crises, right? There may be some people here who can remember way back farther than I can. I wasn't around. Pearl Harbor, right? A major crisis for our country, and people looked for leadership. Many of us here can remember the farm crisis of the 80s, right? Or many of us can remember the terrorist attacks on 9/11. But even for those who remember those, you know what, there's a whole generation. People 30 and under don't remember those things. I keep forgetting. I talk to my kids about something. They look at me like, man, you're really old. Or more recently, one that probably everybody remembers is COVID. Right? During COVID, people were looking for leadership, either looking to the government or looking to their church, their religious leaders. But it was a time when we didn't know what to do. It was a strange time, and no one knew quite how to respond. And so we were looking for leadership, because that's what we do in times of crisis. When we can't handle things on our own, when we're out of control, we look for leadership, someone to help us, to tell us what to do. And in the book of Ruth, there was this crisis. There was a famine. Right? A famine. And we have a tough time relating to a famine. Right? A famine is something that we don't experience because of our transportation system. I mean, we drive 8 miles to get food that's grown thousands of miles away. Right? Imagine if all of our food had to come from what we grew ourselves or the local farmer's market. If all of your food came from what you could raise yourself or the local farmer's market, and then there was a drought, how that would affect you. As it is, if there's a drought and it affects our crops, say that you're raising potatoes, you can still get potatoes from Idaho. And if there's a drought in Idaho, you can still get potatoes from Maine. Right? We get things year-round. We don't even think about it. We get bananas from Honduras or Costa Rica every day of the year. They're not even grown around here. Or we get berries. We get our blueberries, and they might come from Maine, and they might come from Michigan part of the year, but they might come from Peru or Argentina other parts of the year. So imagine a famine. Just imagine if suddenly, if you had to get everything within 5 miles of your house, how would it be? And so this famine came and affected this area. It affected the area of Bethlehem, where Elimelech lived. And Bethlehem literally means the house of bread. The house of bread, because of the fertile soil in the area, because of the good growing conditions, it was considered the breadbasket of Israel. They supplied a lot of the area with grain, with animals, both for food and for sacrifice. But this famine was causing distress. And when things look bad, and when there's no leadership, what do? We take things into our own hands, and we run, right? That's what we tend to do. We run, we try to get away, we move, because the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, we think. And just like Americans during the Dust Bowl who picked up and moved because of the drought that they were experiencing, people were leaving Bethlehem. They were going elsewhere looking for a better life. And with those leaving was this man named Elimelech, along with his wife and kids. Now, I love names in the Bible because they tell us something about the people. We name our kids generally because we like the way it sounds, or because in honor of someone else, a parent or a grandparent or something. But man, in the Bible, when you look at how they named people, you're like, wow, that might have been rough. But Elimelech's name, Elimelech, means God is king. God is king. At a time when there was no king in Israel, this guy has a name that says, God is king. Right? And you would think that with a name like that, every time someone called him, and it means God is king, you would think that would have meant something to him. But apparently it doesn't. Because when things got tough, he takes off with his wife and sons for Moab. And Moab is there, and I don't know, does this thing have a pointer? The top button. Hey, look at that. So, up in here would be the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus spent a lot of his time, the Jordan River, and then we have Jerusalem and Bethlehem here, and Moab is over here on the other side of the Dead Sea. So it was kind of a trek to get, around there. But it was close, but it was distant. You might remember that Moab was named after a man named Moab. The Moabites, they came from this incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. When when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his family left. His wife turned around, a pillar of salt story, and Lot and his daughters ended up in these caves. And they were living there, and Lot's daughters are going, we've lost everything. Nobody is going to marry us after what's happened. We're done. There's no way to continue the family line. And so they get their father drunk, they sleep with him, they become pregnant, and each daughter has a son. Ammon, I think it was Ammon, who became the Ammonites, and Moab, who became the Moabites. So, but Lot was related to Abraham, right? Abraham was Lot's uncle. Lot and Isaac would have been cousins, right? So they were from the same family tree. They had the same grandfather. And so there was this connection between them, but yet there was this distance between them because Moab, born in sin and continued in sin. And so when the Israelites, they had spent the 400 years in Egypt, when they wanted to come back, they wanted to get to the promised land, they wanted to pass through Moab. They wanted to pass through this land to get there. And the Moabites said, no, you can't. We're not going to let you. And so because of that, because of other sins that they did, God had said that a Moabite man could never enter the assembly of the Lord. And the Moabites, they caused the Israelites to sin on multiple occasions. The men would get involved, the Israelite men would get involved with the Moabite women, end up worshiping the Moabite gods, and it was never a good thing. And so the Israelites were told not to associate with the Moabites, but yet don't destroy them because you're related if you go back. So you're related, so don't destroy them, but don't associate with them. And so Elimelech, right, Mr. God is King, he looked at the promised land. He looked at the breadbasket and says, this place holds no promise for me anymore. It only holds death. There's a famine. We're going to die. And so instead of living like God was his king, he was doing what was right in his own eyes, just like many other people in the days of the judges. And just like many of us today. Because we can either live like God is king, or we can live and do what is right in our own eyes, but we can't do both. Right? They're exclusive of each other. There's no way you can do both. You can live like God is your king and submit yourself to his commands and his will, or you can do what is right in your own eyes and be confident that that contradicts what God is doing. So Elimelech, God is king, was doing what was right in his own eyes, and he moved his family from the promised land to this place where he wasn't supposed to be. A place where they worshiped a god named Chemosh, a place where they did child sacrifice, right? A place where God had strictly forbidden his children from going. And he took his wife Naomi. Naomi means God's pleasantness. And he took his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, whose names mean sickly and dying. Right? Now, I don't know if those are the names the mother gave them. I can't imagine the mother's holding her newborn baby and going, oh, here's sickly. Right? So maybe they were named later in life because of their disposition, because of their physicalness, but two men named sickly and dying. And so this family, God is king, God's pleasantness, sickly and dying, they leave the promised land. They leave the breadbasket to do what is right in their own eyes, to do what is forbidden. Anyone see anything wrong with that picture? Right? I mean, everything is wrong with that picture. So picking up in the next verse, in verse 3, it says, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. So things were not going well, right? Naomi, God's pleasantness, her husband dies, leaving her as a widow in a foreign land. And so she had her two sons who married Moabite women, which was something that God had prohibited. And we don't know if she actually approved of this. We don't know if she discouraged it. But we know that within 10 years, both of these guys, sickly and dying, were dead. And so now this crisis that Naomi was facing was even bigger, right? This was a huge disaster because she was alone. She had gone from wife to widow. She'd gone from mother to childless. She'd gone from secure to insecure because all of her identity had been taken from her. Right? It's a male-dominated culture. And so all of her security was in her husband and her sons. And then so with their deaths, all definition of worth was stripped of her. She had no social status. She had no economic means of survival. She was truly alone as a foreigner in a strange land with nothing. Continuing in verse 6, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. And as I spent time studying Ruth, I was struck by the similarities of this and the story that we have in the New Testament, the Second Testament that Jesus told of the prodigal son. Because in both cases, we have someone who rejected authority. One who rejected God, one who rejected his fathers, who represents God in this story. Both go to a foreign land. Both run out of resources. And both, in their desperation and their destituteness, realize they made a mistake and return home with absolutely nothing. And so that's what Naomi sets out to do. She sets out to go home, to this place that she hasn't been for over 10 years. And her two daughter-in-law, the two Moabite daughter-in-laws, who are also widows, they accompany her. And why? Why would they accompany her? Because they had nowhere else to go either. See, when they married, they became part of the husband's family. They left everything else behind. And so, remember, in the Jewish culture, if a woman's husband died, then the husband's brother was supposed to take her as a wife, to raise kids, to keep the husband's name, the family line going. In this case, both brothers died. There was nothing. There was no one else to take them as a wife, but yet they had left their own families. And so the women, they didn't know what else to do, so they clung to their mother-in-law. It was all they had. And Naomi seems to realize the situation, and she tries to convince them to stay. I'm going back to Israel, but you guys stay in Moab. Right? Stay, maybe your parents, if they're still alive, can help you. Maybe you have siblings that can help you. But I'm going back. I'm a widow. I have no resources. You have no husband. You have no resources. You don't want to come and be a stranger in Israel. And so the one daughter-in-law, Orpah, she finally agrees. She hugs and kisses her mother-in-law, Ruth, or Naomi, and she goes back. But Ruth persists and says, no, I'm not going back. Jumping to verse 16, it says, Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or go back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. See, that is quite the statement. That is true devotion. I'll go wherever you go. I'll become one of you. Right? I'll go from being a Moabite to being an Israelite. I'll go from worshiping Chemosh to worshiping Yahweh. Ruth is saying, I'm going to turn my back on everything I know and follow you. Whatever she had left, her culture, her gods, her home, were all gone. She's saying, I'm going to come with you. I'm going to be a foreigner. But I know I'm not going to just be a foreigner, I'm going to be a widowed foreigner with no one to take care of me. And her prospects were really, really bleak. So I've got some good news and some bad news and some good news, and I don't know what all I've got. But the good news is that if we would get to it, we'd see the happily ever after for Ruth. That she ends up getting married and having children, and just like the romance movies, right? The bad news is we're not going to get there today. But the good news is that Ruth is a very short book. Right? I said 4 chapters, 85 verses, so I encourage you to read the whole thing this afternoon. 85 verses does not take you very long, and you can get what Paul Harvey would call the rest of the story. And if you guys are under 30, you have no idea what that meant, but I'm sorry. And then the other news, and I don't know if this is good news or bad news, this is up for you to decide, but I'm going to be back here preaching again in 2 weeks, and subject to the Lord's nudging me to do something else, I plan on preaching on Ruth chapter 2. So good news, bad news, we'll see if it happens, but that's the intent at this point. But today I'm going to stop here at verse 16, and I want to look at how we can relate. Because I often ask, you know the question I'm going to ask when I get about halfway through my sermon or whatever it is. You know the question I'm asking, whose sandals are you in this story? If you were in this account, which footprints would belong to you? So remember Elimelech. God is my king. Right? But he wasn't living like it. He wasn't living. He was doing what was right in his own eyes. And he left God's promised area for his own economic gains. And he justified his actions because of the famine. And how often do we do the same thing? Right? When times get tough, do we trust our king or do we move to Moab? See, we might say something. We might say, God is my king, and so I'm going to Sabbath. I'm going to rest. I'm going to spend time with him. Right? But man, I've got so much to do. And I've got not only my activities, but my kids and my grandkids' activities. And then we just have to, we go. Or maybe you say, yeah, God is my king. And so I'm going to tithe 10%. I'm going to shoot for more. Except, times are tough and Christmas is just around the corner. And I've got stuff to do. I've got presents to buy for everybody. And I've got to stretch every dollar. Luke, you said something about, you didn't say stepping on toes, but you said something along those lines this morning. Maybe we say, man, I'm not going to take any drugs that would alter me, right? Nothing that affects me. I want to be pure. Just don't talk to me about it until after I've had my caffeine. Right? You get the point. If we look hard enough, we see things in ourselves. I had a preacher friend that used to tell me, he says, you need to learn how to step on people's toes without breaking them. He says the key is to bruise but not break. And so for all of us, including myself, as I studied this, I'm like, ouch, that's starting to hurt. And hopefully I can do that. I can bruise without break. But I ask each one of you, Mr. or Mrs., God is my king. Do you trust God or do you flee to Moab? See, when times are tough, Moab looks tempting. It looks better. And many of us have gone to that forbidden place for a lot less reason than what Elimelech did. And many of us have gone into sin for a lot less than what he did. But Elimelech, he left Bethlehem so that he wouldn't die, so that he could save his family, and then he died. Or maybe you are in Naomi's sandals. Maybe you're following her footpath because she followed her husband to this place where she shouldn't have been. And then she stayed there for 10 years. 10 years she stayed there. And she experienced sorrow. Tons of sorrow. She buried her husband and her 2 sons. And we kind of expect that we're going to have to bury our parents, right? I mean, I'm so fortunate. I'm 59. My parents are both still alive. My in-laws are both still alive. I have not had to bury a close family member yet. But when I was visiting my parents a year or two ago, we went to the funeral home and made arrangements. And that's something, you guys probably have never thought about that. There's going to come a day when most of you guys are going to bury your parents. You can thank me for bringing you the good news. Yeah, right? But that's something that she had to do. But none of us, we kind of know in the back of our head we have to bury our parents. We know that about half of us are going to have to bury a spouse. Right? Some of you have had to do that. But nobody expects that they have to bury their own children. And I know some of you have done that too. That's not the way it's supposed to work. Right? But that's what Naomi had to do. She had to bury her husband and her children. And then she had no social network, nothing there to help her. And so she had her identity taken. She had loss of income, loss of resources, and yet she stayed. Yes, she stayed in this place she wasn't supposed to be. Are you walking in Naomi's footprints? Because if you are, we need to talk. Because in verse 6, it said, while she was stuck in Moab, she heard that the famine had ended, that food was plentiful again in Israel. And if you are feeling stuck in Moab, right, if you're feeling helpless and alone, I've got good news for you. Because it's time to come home. It's time to come home. Right? Return to the breadbasket. God cares. Jesus came. He paid our debts. There's no need to run or hide. He's calling us home. Or maybe there's someone that is here this morning, or there's someone who's watching, who's in Ruth sandals. And you've met someone who's different. You've met someone, there's something about them. There's this faith that they have. And you don't totally understand it. And you've been through a lot yourself. Right? Like Ruth, you've suffered loss. Maybe a physical loss, maybe a death, maybe a loss of income, maybe loss of identity or self-worth. But Ruth, this widow in loss, she recognized that her mother-in-law had something different. And she was willing to leave everything for it. Her culture, any family that she had left, she was willing to leave everything to follow Ruth, to find out more. And this faith that she saw that was displayed in Naomi, she said she wanted it. She embraced it. She wanted to be part of this people. She said, your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And so if that's you this morning, if you are looking and saying, I don't totally understand this, man, come talk to me, please. Come talk to me. Let me tell you about my God. Let me tell you about His love for you and His joy of knowing Him. Let me introduce you to Him so you can know Him too. But the question every one of us needs to answer is, what is our Moab? What in your life do you need to leave behind? What do you need to see in your mirror as you're driving away from it? What are you doing that might be right in your eyes, but not in God's? The last time I was here, I was preaching on 1 John. In 1 John, verse 8, it says, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. So he's saying, we have sin in our lives. And so I ask again, what is the Moab? What is the sin that you need to leave behind, that you should see only in the rearview mirror? And it's not always easy to see, right? But John says it's there. So if you're doing what's right in your own eyes, maybe you need the glasses I had a few times ago when I preached, the God glasses, right? So you can actually look at yourself critically and say, whoa, that doesn't belong there. Maybe then we can see our faults and our disobedience. But what is the Moab that needs to be left in our rearview mirror? And also then, what are we returning to? What are we going to? What will the future hold? What will our legacy be? Because we might not know. We might not know, and that's okay. Ruth and Naomi, they had no idea when they left Moab, two widows traveling together, going back with no hope. And yet Ruth, this foreigner, right? This foreigner that converted to the faith of Israel, she became the grandmother of David, the first king, and a member of the royal line of Jesus. If it weren't for Ruth, if it weren't for this Moabite woman who followed Naomi, we probably wouldn't even know about Bethlehem. It would just be the place where I think Rachel was buried, was on the road to Bethlehem. We probably wouldn't even know about it if it wasn't for this foreign widow who was trying to pursue God. And so I've asked a lot of questions this morning. And I know you might need to dig deep to find answers, but I hope you do. I hope you, if you come and if you don't do anything, we've all wasted some time this morning. But we all have areas where we're stuck in Moab, and it's time to move on. The only way to get to the right place is to leave the wrong one. So, where is the Moab in your life? Because it's time to leave it behind. It's time to go away so you only see it in the rearview mirror.